The world has never seen anything quite like it. As the pandemic throws up new COVID variants, the future of global economies is once again under the scanner. What does the future hold? How soon will we be back to a pre-pandemic economic universe? Will inflation force RBI to hike interest rates? What are the specific challenges India faces? And what's going right and wrong with the Indian economy? It's time for answers. In conversation with Dr. Raghuram Rajan.
Hello and welcome to this India Today special. 2021 has been a year like no other. A year of a roller coaster ride for Indian and global economies as COVID variant after variant threatens to disrupt and destroy lives and livelihoods. What is the big picture then? Joining us now is a very special guest, one of the world's most influential voices on the economy, former Reserve Bank of India Governor and Professor at the Booth School of Business, Chicago, Dr. Raghuram Rajan. Thank you very much for joining me. What's the big picture? Because just as we thought it was safe to predict a global economic recovery, along comes Omicron. Do you fear that we are again heading towards uncertain times?
Well, we are in uncertain times. We never got out of it. And you know, there are multiple factors at work here. First, of course, is the virus and its ever morphing variants. Nature is telling us you can push back, but you can't completely control it. And what is true, however, is that at least when you look at the path of the variants of the virus, we have gotten better. Hospitalizations are lower than in the past. Of course, the virus is also changing. We don't know if Omicron is just more infectious or whether it's also more deadly, whether it creates the same level of hospitalization per number of cases. We will know soon. But the hope is we are getting better at defending against the virus, and it becomes something which becomes part of the background scenery as so many other diseases and infections have become. Now, on the response economically, the initial response was massive lockdowns. We're seeing far fewer of them. We're learning to live with the virus, with perhaps a few exceptions like China, which are still trying to eradicate it completely, and therefore are more likely to go into lockdowns and disruptive economic situations. So what's the bottom line? Bottom line is we spent enormously in industrial countries in fighting the early waves of the virus. The good news is a lot of that spending has supported economic activity, and there's still a lot of pent-up demand waiting to come out as more goods are available, as more services become available. So that is the positive boost to the world economy. And we're seeing it across the world, even in countries that haven't had similar levels of stimulus, because exports are roaring. They're going through the roof. So that's the good side. What's the bad side? The bad side is there's a lot of scarring. There's a lot of scarring, especially in countries that haven't been able to put out support. And you can see it in Latin America, you can see it in South Asia, you can see it in India, that much more unemployment, or at least much more rural employment, which is a form of unemployment, which is sort of unprecedented. So in a sense, the world is dividing into two, the countries that are doing really well, the countries doing not so well, and within country, again, it's dividing between those who have been affected by the virus and who are really hit hard, and those who have not and who have a lot of money to spend. And India is no different. There is a division even within India, the upper middle class versus the lower middle class.
Sure, there's this India versus Bharat divide, the sort of two countries that only seems to have got accentuated in these pandemic times. I'll come to that in a moment, but is your sense that the worst is over? That perhaps we will see a steady economic recovery, even allowing for these variants, assuming that they're not as deadly as the previous ones?
I think given that assumption, we are on the way out. That we are learning to live with the virus. and we are learning how to manage our economies in this process. And of course, the amount of pent-up demand is going to take us still a little further. Now, of course, there's the other disease which we are facing, which is the excess, which results in inflation. I mean, part of what people focus on is the supply side constraints. But what they don't accept that easily is the level of demand is also enormous relative to normal times, especially in certain sectors. Goods demand has gone up because you can't spend on services. As a result, it has fouled up the supply chains because so much is being asked. The problem, of course, is the longer this stays in a state of snafu, the more it spreads into prices. You can see higher transportation costs are now showing their way into higher prices. You can see labor very tight in many industrial countries, showing up in higher wages, higher inflation. And of course, inflation doesn't stay restricted to one part of the world, it spreads more widely. So the problem we are seeing now is perhaps excess demand relative to supply, which is resulting in higher inflation. Number of emerging markets, central banks have already started tightening. And so what that does is constrain the amount of space down the line.
And presumably India will also have to do some kind of tightening of interest rates, given that inflation remains a concern, because as the latest Economist cover story suggests, Omicron, inflation and a slowing China as the three major threats in the near term.
Right.
You'd go along with that?
Well, we certainly have to pay attention to inflation. In India, headline has fluctuated, but the core inflation has been quite strong. So it is something that we will have to pay attention to, and I'm sure, I think the Monetary Policy Committee is deliberating today on what to do. I think for the world in general, I would agree with these three risks. 3 weeks ago, I'd have put the latter two, inflation and a slowing China, on top of the list. Of course, Omicron, trying to figure out how it will affect things is a new factor. But yes, some of this represents opportunity, of course. In a slowing China, there are some countries that are rising to fill the space. Even in these times of supply chains getting constricted, etc., there are countries that have some spare capacity that can ramp up, that can find opportunity in this. So it's not entirely a bleak scenario, but also remember that part of what is causing inflation is really the enormous support that has been given in industrial countries, the enormous sort of number of jobs that have been created relative to where we were in the bottom of the pandemic. So there's some positive news also in some of all this.
But if you were Reserve Bank of India governor, still you'd be conscious of inflation.
I would certainly,
as your major challenge at the moment.
I think it's always tempered with what the growth situation is, right? You have to think about whether there's enough supply capacity in the economy so that you can survive this level of demand without inflation going through the roof. I think in India we are seeing a rebounding economy. The question that the Reserve Bank will have to address, of course, is this rebound so strong that it's exceeding our supply capacity? The fact that inflation is still quite strong suggests that question is not an irrelevant question.
Let's look at the Indian economy for a moment, because there's a general belief, at least India's economy managers say, we've come out of the pandemic, or hopefully the tail end of the pandemic, a little stronger than other countries. Last quarter, a growth rate 8.4, before that 20%, suggesting, they say, a V-shaped recovery. Do you see it as a V-shape, or do you see it, as you earlier told me, India versus Bharat conflict? Two countries in a way, one struggling to come out of the pandemic, the other moving ahead and seizing opportunity.
Well, both can be true at the aggregate level. Now, V-shaped is not anything to crow about. Create a bad enough downturn and the recovery will always be V-shaped. I think what is important is, have we sort of come out of the earlier malaise, and are we going to reach back to our trend level of growth? Now, to some extent, we are back to where we were in 2019. A number of countries are there, so we're not the only country that's back. But we also were a reasonably fast-growing country. 5%, 6% was what we were growing. Now, we haven't done that over the last 2 years. So effectively, we've just made up the ground that we lost in going down, but we haven't made up the ground we lost because we were already growing at a fast pace.
Sure.
And that growth has to be made up still. And that will still take some time to make up. So before we start growing, we have to say, look, are we at a reasonable place to grow further? And I think we are. We are. But we have to do a lot of things to try and get the growth that India truly deserves. Where we should be growing is 8, 9%, right? That's what's necessary to create the jobs for all the young people coming out. You know, we had this population dividend. That population dividend becomes a dividend only if those young people can get jobs. So the question we should be asking ourselves is, how do we multiply the number of jobs? And is it only through, some kind of focus on manufacturing, or can we emphasize the areas of the economy which have always done well for us, services? We've got a fantastic IT sector, which is benefiting from the global boom. Today, it's very, very hard to find people in the IT sector because, that's where employment is. You talked about two Indias. India is the IT sector.
Sure.
Bharat is in the villages. Bharat is in traditional manufacturing, where we still are not investing too much because demand is still low. What we need to do is pump up India, but also find ways to support Bharat in a much more effective way. I don't like the words Bharat and India. It sort of seems, but the areas that are lagging behind, can we, make them a force multiplier? Why should agriculture be lagging in India? Why can't it be the source of tremendous amounts of new jobs? Because we increase the value added in agriculture, not just through traditional farming, but more value added growth in agriculture.
Because agricultural growth has been high. If you look at it relatively agricultural growth has been high, and that's the sense that, it's sector-wise, the growth seems to be, hospitality has been hit very badly, construction's been hit badly, but if you look at steel, India's exporting. So, it seems almost as if, far from being V-shaped, it's about W-shaped, as some call it, sector-wise.
It's different shapes based on different sectors. We have sectors that have been very badly hit. Small and medium enterprises, for example.
MSMEs have struggled.
Yeah. They have struggled. Look at the NPAs in the MSME sector. They're really very high. So there are sectors that have been hit. There are sectors that have done very well. Look at the big firms. Many of them have been able to pay down some of the debt. Some of them have been able to raise stock. And of course, we have this picture of unicorns coming to the market, with the exception of Paytm, but doing really well. So, as in India, across the world, there's a mixed picture. It's wrong to just pick one part of it and say wonderful, but it's also wrong to pick another part and say terrible. I think what we need to do is find ways to help the sectors that have been badly affected. And there, I think one of the biggest worries in India is the household sector, especially lower middle class households, where, again, this number, we used to have 36% of the employment in agriculture, has gone up to 39%. In a growing country, agricultural employment never goes up, it goes down, because people are moving away to services and manufacturing. That it has gone up suggests people have gone back to their villages and resumed that low productivity jobs that they had because there are no alternatives. Those are households that are suffering. And we need to figure out ways to help them move to higher productivity activities, to get the jobs that would really put India on a much higher plane.
You emphasized agriculture. At a time when there's been this vociferous debate in this country over the new farm laws, eventually repealed, pulled back by the Prime Minister. What's your sense? Because many agriculture economists who one speaks to, believe that there is an urgent need for agrarian reform to ensure crop diversification, to ensure incomes arise, to ensure that people get more quality jobs in agriculture. Yeah. Do you believe that the farm reforms were actually a step in the right direction, and the government should have stuck to its guns?
No, look, I think there are elements in those farm laws which I think many people would agree to. The point is the package as a whole had some problems. The greater problem is that different states, different regions in India require different parts of the package. And there's a lot of differentiation across the regions. Some regions, for example, don't have strong agricultural markets. Others have well-functioning agricultural markets. So the one-size-fits-all doesn't really apply. And part of the sort of reason for pushback is the attempt to put a one-size-fits-all framework on India. We need to have a framework which is much more sensitive to the different demands of different regions. Now, that said, I think we do recognize, and I think farmers also recognize, that you can't continue producing rice and wheat in such quantities, especially rice in some of the most water-starved areas of the country. So we need to have a more sensible policy which shifts production to some other crops which are more needed. But right now, farmers are doing what is most remunerative and what is most supported. So we have to find ways to shift this. But this has to be done in a sensitive way, in a way that assures them that the incomes will not disappear overnight.
In a sense, what you're calling for is a decentralization of farm reforms where states could have had perhaps greater power and autonomy over the kind of reforms they needed for their specific situation. So Punjab would be very different, let's say, to a Tamil Nadu, to a Maharashtra.
Exactly. I think what the centre's job is to give an overlying framework within which there can be a lot of decentralization. It's not the centre's role to micromanage what happens everywhere and to say this will be the laws. And I think that's the way, in a sense, think of how big our country is, 1.3 billion people. We are 2 to 3 times the size of the European Union, which is 27 countries, right? Mm-hmm. The reality is India is too big to be managed from the center. And we have to figure out what should be managed from the center, what should be decentralized. And a lot more needs to be decentralized. That's what every finance commission in India has said till the 15th Finance Commission, decentralize more.
So what you're saying net is that you support farm reform, but you're saying that it needs to be done in a more consultative, decentralized manner, respecting the fact that one size doesn't fit all in a country like India.
Absolutely.
That's effectively what you're saying.
Absolutely, and it's representative of much else about the economic situation in India. There's so much that can be done by the states within an overall framework that the center sets. The center doesn't have to do everything.
Like a minimum support price, because the farmers are now calling for almost a legally mandated MSP. Now, that would be tough for the central government to do, but possibly a particular state government could go ahead and do it.
Yeah, I'm told, for example, Haryana decided that they would support bajra prices.
Yes.
By effectively giving a differential to farmers. The point is there are creative people in every state who will find different solutions. And over time, if a particular solution works in a particular state, other states will look at it and say, that makes sense, why don't we do it? And it will spread. I think the whole point of the center is to create the framework where this can happen and bring states together for best practice. This need not happen in every situation, that I agree. But in many situations, the creativity of the states can be enlisted.
Because there's a fear that in a democracy like India, you'll always have pressure groups who will push for their own vested interests in whenever you're bringing in major disruptive reforms. And we've seen that post 1991, that reforms often have to be brought into this country by stealth as a result. What's the solution? Do you believe democracy is actually an impediment at times then to the kind of far-reaching reforms that maybe we need?
No, but I think that in the guise of democracy being an impediment, the answer is not to have a structure which listens to nobody and proposes something which doesn't have widespread support. The whole idea is try and build consensus, listen to people, give people the sense they listen to, and don't disempower them. Democracy works by empowering people. If you take away their powers and concentrate it all at the center in a small group, then there's resistance. We were never consulted. We have no power in this new structure, and there is of course protest. Now, you cannot empower everybody. You cannot listen to everybody because they have contradictory views. Ultimately, you have to decide, but you can decide in a way that is more inclusive, and people then will, there will be protests, but it will be somewhat more diffuse. Now, I agree that in this country we have gotten used to the idea that there can be no reform which is open, which is it has to be by stealth or it has to be pushed down. But we've also seen now, in a well-connected, media-savvy, media-friendly world, it's very hard to do things by stealth. And the pushback comes very quickly.
There's a message in what you're sending to the Modi model, in a way. That's the sense I get, that you cannot be overly centralized in a country like India. You've got to be more consultative. From agriculture to MSMEs, you mentioned that is a concern. The fact that a large sector of smaller enterprises, micro enterprises, those in the unorganized sector particularly suffered in pandemic times. Now, many of them complain, and some of them have told me banks don't lend.
Yeah.
The government has attempted to try and create lending processes for them, but many of them come around and say, look, banks are not lending. Yeah. What would you do in such a scenario?
Well, it's a tough scenario, right? So in this situation where there has been sort of very little demand for some of the products the MSMEs make, where some of the MSMEs sort of lose out to the big firms that are able to access financial markets, the stock markets, raise equity, pay down some of their debts, they are financially also at a disadvantage. Now, the government has, to its credit, sort of helped the MSMEs out, tried to tell the banks we'll guarantee some of these debts, perhaps in some cases excessively so. But the net effect is, despite all that, banks are still very wary. Now, some of it comes from the bank's own situation. Many of them are sitting on high NPAs and are unwilling to expand them by lending more. And
which your critics will say is a legacy from the years when you were also around at the RBI.
The fact that you recognize NPAs doesn't mean you create them.
Yes.
I think we force them to recognize it, which is a way of trying to reduce them rather than... The reality is that it is always hard, even in the US, even in many other industrial countries, to lend to small enterprises. Often there's an element of subsidy in that lending. But my sense is we need to focus much more on creating the environment where the MSMEs have a good economic future. And then the financing will follow, maybe with a little bit of subsidy. But right now what is happening is, because of the various changes that have taken place, it is really difficult being an MSME in this kind of environment economically. And unless that changes, all the world of financing will not make a huge difference.
Would you support, though, providing those at the bottom of the pyramid who are struggling, particularly in these times, with some kind of a minimum income guarantee or some support scheme? Would you support it, a nationwide scheme, or do you believe we just don't have the bandwidth, resource-wise, revenue-wise, to do it?
I think minimum support, to the extent that it's necessary to keep body and soul together, is something this country can afford. We have to target it reasonably, but we have the means to do it if we put effort into that. There are exclusions that we can apply. If you do this, if you have a car, if you have a swanky car, you cannot possibly participate in the scheme, etc., etc. We can have those exclusions. We can also have inclusive criteria, but we can target it's not going to be perfect, but we can target and offer some resources to keep body and soul together. I think we should do that. An alternative would be to we have a rural unemployment program. We should create more of an urban unemployment program. And that is something Jean Reyes has talked about. These are things we can certainly look into and are necessary to deal with bad times like the ones that our migrants in the urban areas experience. So we really have to provide a basic safety net. Mm-hmm. Now, once you go beyond that, then the issue of affordability starts coming in. How much can we, as a still not very rich country, barely middle income, can afford in terms of safety nets? And the real answer is grow the pie. And then, as you're growing it, ensure that you have more benefits, in terms of safety net. Certainly health benefits are important, so given the pandemic we've been through, but also the appalling state of healthcare that people have access to. We need to improve that, and we need to work on that. Education. We need to give people a chance. Education is a sector which has suffered tremendously. You asked, these kids who go to schools where, at best, and I'm saying at best, they've been doing their lessons on a 3x6 screen. And just imagine what kind of learning they would have. They've basically regressed. And now to get them back, you need to give them remedial learning. You can't just put them 2 grades ahead and expect they'll do fine after having missed 2 years of school. You have to give them remedial learning to get them back to where they were 2 years ago. And only then, how many households are going to be willing to see their kids spend 2.5, 3 years getting back on track? It's going to be tough. We need a lot of work so as to keep from losing an entire generation of students. That's some of the challenges we face. But I think these are the kinds of things we need to work on.
Because, we've seen public investment in infrastructure going up to a substantial extent in the last couple of years.
Right.
And it's one of the achievements of the Modi government. But we haven't seen the same investments in education and health, which are going to be critical going ahead, particularly in a post-pandemic world, because you are then creating a very divided society in terms of access to quality healthcare and quality education, as we've seen during the pandemic.
Right, and I'm talking about this not especially on education, not just on going forward, what kind of educational experience people have, but in repairing the damage done by the pandemic. If we are not careful, we will lose an enormous number of students because those students are now out of place in class, they haven't kept up, they don't know what's going on. And very soon, parents are going to say, why do I need my child in class? If it's a girl child, let me get her married off. If it's a boy child, let me take him to work in the fields. This is the kind of tension that we might face going forward unless we invest both in remedial action, which is saving our kids, but also going forward in improving the quality of education.
Because if I look at numbers, private investments is almost back at pre-pandemic levels. In fact, in some sectors has gone above pre-pandemic levels, but consumption has remained tempered down and hasn't really picked up. So how do you put money in disposable income in people's pockets so that they actually are incentivized to go out there and spend?
Well, that's an indicator, right, of the divide. That on the one hand, our big firms are doing really well. Export demand is through the roof. And IT sector, as I said, doing wonderfully well. We should be very happy about that. That's good news. On the other hand, consumption, which has been the mainstay of the Indian economy in the past, is much weaker today. It's not growing as fast as it used to. It used to outstrip the other sources of demand. It's not. And part of the reason simply is a lot of households are uncertain about the future. They don't have jobs, or some of them have lost jobs. Certainly they've experienced some hit through the pandemic. The World Bank came out with this number. One doesn't know how useful these numbers are, but 75 million more people in poverty. That's a mind-boggling number. And I hope it's temporary, but it does reflect a weakness then, because the lowest income households are the ones that spend the most out of the rupee that they get. And if those households are frightened, are waiting on the sidelines, it means that after a burst of rebound, after the pent-up demand is through, we have much weaker growth. And you see that in some of the forecasts. JP Morgan, stronger growth this year and next year, but then it tapers off because we go back to slower growth. Some of that is because, of the potential scarring.
So we need to create some kind of an income safety net possibly for those at the bottom of the pyramid.
I think safety net would be one, but we also need to worry about the education, getting education of children, getting it back on track. That requires a tremendous amount of effort. I've been talking to the Tamil Nadu government, which is trying to do that, get children accustomed to going back to class at the first level, and then ramping up so that they come back to where they were and then move forward for the few years they've missed. That's a lot of work that needs to be done. But healthcare, another place where we need investment. So in addition to the investments on hard infrastructure, we need a lot of investment in soft infrastructure, not just to repair the damage, but to move forward to take our legitimate place.
Let me turn to an issue which has grabbed the headlines recently, cryptocurrency. There is a huge debate at the moment. Do you regulate it or do you ban cryptocurrency? The Reserve Bank of India governor, one of your successors, has come up and said very clearly that he seems very, very skeptical about cryptocurrency and worried about cryptocurrency. What's your sense?
Well, I think the technologies behind cryptocurrency are certainly very interesting and will, over time, be more widely used. For example, blockchain, decentralized ledgers, which are really what blockchains are. Some of this new fintech trying to sort of gather information together could solve some of the problems that we're talking about. So MSMEs, for example, if a provider could get all the payments that are going out of the MSME and into the MSME, that gives you a sense of the MSME's true financial picture and then allows you to offer credit on that basis. Yes, this is a good firm. No, it hasn't been in existence for 15 years, but at least based on their first year's receipts, I can predict where they're going and I can then offer it more credit. So these new technologies, not just blockchain, but everything else associated with fintech, can allow us to do far more. Now in India, you've already seen UPI, which we started in my time, has gotten so much sway, 4 billion transactions plus a month. I mean, this is extraordinary. It shows the capabilities of financial technology. So if you think of crypto as being one part of that, you don't want to kill it. On the other hand, is it something which is $2.5 trillion worth? Can you see value there of 2.5 trillion? There, I think you would find far more skeptics. Because what is the true value of cryptocurrency other than making payments? Right now, it's very hard to see that. Even for payments, it is relatively, there are many other competing ways to make payments. In India, you can make payments through UPI. So it's hard to see a huge magnitude of value associated with more than a few cryptocurrencies. I have no doubt a few of them, Ether, etc., might survive. But there are 6,000 cryptocurrencies. Will all of them survive? Probably not. And this is where the regulator gets worried. Supposing I say this is fine to invest in, and 98% of these go bust, then I'm sort of, as a regulator, I've just put my chapa on them, and people have lost money. So, you're damned if you regulate and say they're okay. But if you don't regulate them, it becomes a Wild West, right? People raising money from the public without any questions being asked, without any sense that this is a reasonable scheme and unreasonable scheme. So in a sense, you're caught between a rock and a hard place as a regulator. If you regulate it, people run to invest more, and that's a problem. If you don't regulate it, it becomes the Wild West, and people invest in it and say, you should have been regulating when they lose money. So it's tough.
So what you're calling for essentially is regulate cryptocurrencies, don't ban them. Am I correct broadly? Because the government seems to be suggesting under a proposed regulation that cryptocurrencies could be renamed as crypto assets. They could then be regulated by SEBI. Is that what you see happening?
Yeah.
Or do you believe that there needs to be some regulation, but don't ban them?
I think there needs to be more information. And I think regulators need to understand better what they're dealing with. I think what they can do is prevent, to the extent they can, outright fraud. But I think it's very, very hard for a regulator to pronounce on the value of the crypto assets or the cryptocurrencies. And it's very hard to say the money is being well used. Remember, what is happening is the crypto asset is issued, the promoter gets the money, and then they can spend it any which way they want, right? They're not committing to having the money that's raised kept inside whatever vehicle that raises it. So I think that what I'm saying is regulators need to understand this better, get the capabilities, acquire the knowledge.
Get more information in a way from these crypto entities before taking a call on the nature of legislation.
Exactly. And that they need to be very careful about a blanket ban, because that will drive this whole process underground. And it's not clear whether they have the ability to deal with it when it goes underground. As it is, a fair amount of crypto transactions are used to evade taxation authorities. So in what sense, are you able to regulate it when it is below the radar screen? So I think we need to understand more how we can actually make a difference here. And I think we have to be very careful about ever saying this is either a viable investment and you should invest in it, or before we know it, sort of ruling it out. Because then you might rule out certain technologies which we can never use. I think at this point, an agnostic attitude is reasonable, where we collect information, and if we see that trading in any one asset is going beyond what we think are reasonable norms, many people are piling into it, we should probably offer public warnings. This is, not something that is vetted by the government or the regulator, and is something that you could lose money on. But beyond that, I think at this point, we don't know enough to take a firm view.
So this is not the right moment then to legislate. You would wait for a while, get more information, and then proceed with legislation, because again, legislation could have far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, it depends to some extent on what the legislation is, but I think anything that is extreme is at this point, we don't know enough.
Let's come back, therefore, in conclusion to the bigger picture. As you said, we've looked at potential risks going ahead in these post-pandemic times. Your sense about the long-term future of this country? There was so much of talk of being a 5 trillion economy by 2025. The slowing down puts a huge question mark over that. What would you, if you were advising Prime Minister Modi today, what would be A, B, C, the top 3 things you would tell him to focus on in the next 4 years?
Well, I'm not advising Prime Minister Modi, but let me talk broadly about, India has immense potential. The country has such, when you look at our youth and what they can achieve, what they have achieved, what Indians across the world are achieving, you know that there is no limit to what we can do. But we have to be sensible. We have to know that we have weaknesses. We are not a country without weaknesses. We have to work to remedy those weaknesses. I think when we go sort of in a very complacent way, saying we have arrived, that's when we make our worst mistakes. So I would say, let us look at the pandemic scenario and identify the problems where in fact the pandemic has scarred the economy. And let's try and fix those. Just simply saying it doesn't exist will not help. Let's look at the MSME bad debts. How do we straighten that out? Let's look at the households that have been scarred. Let's look at schooling. Let's pick up the problems and fix them rather than papering over them. In the meantime, by all means, our unicorns will continue doing fantastically well. They will still go IPO. And, as the word you use, India will do fine. To the extent that you need to help, you can help there. But a lot more government effort, given limited government capacity, has been to help Bharat, which is not doing so well. And so let's figure out what needs to be done and work on that. It's always fun working on the stuff that's going well.
Because historically, crises have provided opportunities. The America story post the depression of the 1930s, and many believe India could use this pandemic to sort of reorient priorities and make this India's great opportunity. Do you see the government? You've been perceived, I must be honest, as a critic of the of this particular government. What would you say the government's done right in the last 24 months, and what has it not done right?
I think after the realization that the vaccine response was way below par, I think the government has picked up, and I think in a large country like ours, reaching 50% is commendable. That's one example of what's gone right. I think the initial response was we've overcome it, was complacent. That's what I was referring to as the problem. When you think we've arrived, we don't see our weaknesses and we don't deal with it.
Sure, in February this year, it seemed, the government seemed to suggest almost as if the pandemic was over.
Exactly. But I think more broadly, I think India's way forward has to depend on India's historic strengths, which is our debate, our democracy, etc. The worst mistake we can make is to think that we can be like China. We can't be like China for the simple reason that their system is not our system. Their authoritarianism, their lack of democracy, their lack of debate has, they've worked within that system to create a manufacturing superpower. With our system, we'll be a shadow of them if we try walking the same path. We need our own system, a system which relies on what our strengths are, and which may mean that instead of going along that manufacturing-led growth path, we go in a different path. I mean, our services are very strong. People trust our IT. People trust us to keep their information. Why don't we strengthen that? Maybe we can provide sort of payment services to the rest of the world. But for that, you have to have much stronger data protection. You have to be able to tell the world, our government cannot reach the data that our private firms collect because we have such strong data protections. Then they will trust us. Otherwise, why would anybody trust us to maintain their medical data, their legal data, their financial data? So in this new world, let's not just try and emulate China and say we need more manufacturing-led growth. That's good, it's useful, but maybe there are other pathways which we can try. We can become the education capital for the world. Strengthen our universities, provide education to Africa, to the Middle East, to South Asia. Why can't we do that? There are lots of opportunities we can seize on if we are willing to think differently, but rely on our strengths rather than emulate somebody who has an entirely different system and an entirely different set of strengths.
Interesting, because I know that you're working closely with the government of Tamil Nadu. I often wonder, will Raghuram Rajan return to India in some form on a more permanent basis? Would you happily come back? I've asked you this in the past, to advise governments in the turbulent times that we live. I mean, in these uncertain times, you need people who perhaps will provide very well-meaning advice.
Yeah, well, I think all of us I would say all the Indians outside are willing to help as and when their help is required. So yes, look.
So if the finance minister calls you tomorrow and says, Raghu, I need you to come and give me some advice.
I have never said no to any request from India. But I think the reality is that we have plenty of strong, capable Indian minds also. And we just need to use them. There are lots of really good economists who have ideas on what we need to do. And we can take it up. My broader point really is that there are no limits to what India can achieve, but it has to harness the strength of its people, and that, I think, doing that. I mean, you talked about farm laws, and we said again, if you harness the energy of our states, harnessed and got a more creative structure, maybe there's no limit to what we can achieve on agriculture. We need to do far more. I mean, agricultural productivity has still a long way to go, but we could do it. And it's not for dearth of ideas, dearth of people. There are plenty of them, there are plenty of people. It's sort of bringing it up, taking advantage of it and putting it into action.
Look, you've given us plenty of food for thought, Dr. Rajan. I've got coffee organized. I thought that the South Indian in you would like the coffee. You haven't touched the coffee. I've got chocolates. What are you going to go for?
This is all wonderful. I think I'll take a sip of coffee.
You'll take a sip of coffee. Professor Rajan, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today on this very special, in these very difficult times. You've given us a broad sweep of what lies ahead. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Raghuram Rajan in this India Today special. Thanks for watching. Time for some coffee.